Welcome, everybody. We're going to get started in just a minute. Hello, everybody. Welcome to Vendor Assessments. Where are the clear areas of risk? This webinar will run about 45 minutes and will include time for a Q&A. Please send any questions that you have to us in the Q&A box on your screen, and we'll try to get to everyone's questions. We have two great speakers today. First, let me introduce Harrison Welsh. Harrison is a senior security consultant at Intraprise Health. He's a member of our information security management team and is focused on third-party risk management. Harrison works closely with clients, helping them evaluate and manage their vendor assessments. Today, Harrison will give us the benefit of what he has learned coming through hundreds of vendor assessments. Our other speaker is Vikas Khosla. Vikas is Intraprise Health's Chief Digital Health Security Officer. Vikas has a truly global view of enterprise risk management and regularly speaks with CISOs throughout the country on security issues they are facing. Vikas, why don't you get us started?
Thank you, Siobhan. Really appreciate it, and great to be with you today, Harrison. And thank you to all of our attendees for joining us today. I think we're going to have a really good discussion. And as Siobhan mentioned, please, we welcome any and all questions. We will go through the presentation in about 30 minutes, and then we'll start Q&A thereafter. But certainly welcome you to submit all your questions. We'd love to have a good dialogue there. So just a little bit about Intraprise Health. We've been in the cybersecurity focused on healthcare business for over 10 years and really have focused ourselves on providing risk management solutions from compliance to assurance to really ultimately delivering resiliency. And Harrison's driving the deck, so you're going to hear me prompt him to move us forward. So Harrison, we move to the next slide. And really the way that Intraprise Health approaches the marketplace is really by developing long-term partnerships with our clients, primarily by delivering what we call tech-enabled services, and you can see some of those here. Harrison, next slide. So in the topic that we're talking about today, so, why do we have sort of the expertise and competency to talk about these matters? One, as you heard, Harrison has really a depth of experience specifically around third-party risk management. But as an organization, we've, for the decade plus that we've been in business, we've clearly done a lot of different types of security risk assessments, including third-party risk assessments. And we've worked with many different kinds of organizations, really hundreds and hundreds of organizations, from startups to Fortune 500, Fortune 50 type of companies. And we have been long-standing believers in framework-based holistic approaches to security risk management. So primarily our risk assessments are based in either NIST or on HITRUST. We're the longest standing HITRUST assessor, in fact. And we not only focus on third-party risks, but we also look at the downstream effects and the potential risks that exist in fourth and fifth parties as well. And you'll hear some of that, I think, context, if you will, as we go through our discussion. And ultimately, what we're trying to deliver is a holistic solution, a holistic approach to third-party risk management that ultimately mitigates risk, and we'll talk about at the end, really leads to proper, unified, informed, shared decision-making. So those are really our objectives. So now let's get into our key topics for today. And Harrison and I will, he'll be our primary speaker, but he and I will definitely sort of tackle some of these things together. But what we're looking at in terms of really trying to glean from all the work that we've done and the expertise that has been developed and working in the trenches and working strategically with our customers is starting to look at some of these key topics, key areas that security professionals that are running these programs and operating them can really start to hopefully take away from this particular discussion. So what are the leading areas of non-compliance or gaps that we're seeing out there in these assessments? How do vendors respond and react when we engage with them, and whether it's initially or whether it's after the assessment is done? So really some interesting insights there. And what are those areas that they struggle with most? That you know, and I'd rather call them partners than vendors. I know we all think from a partner perspective, but you know, what do the vendors really struggle with? I think that could be key in helping you know, security folks that are running these programs to really start to optimize what they're doing and get better results. And then ultimately, how can organizations really achieve, as I mentioned previously, sort of a unified, informed decision-making posture? And there's another key element to this also, which is automation and scalability. And we'll talk about that also and discuss how you can start to implement or introduce automation to help with scalability of your programs. So hopefully some good takeaways for everyone today based on these discussions. Harrison, we'll go to the next slide. So with that,
awesome. Thanks, Rick.
Sorry. With that, we'll get into our first topic. And I know you're going to cover this in about 2 slides, so let's talk about some of our top areas of non-compliance.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Vikas. So, hi, everyone. Thanks for joining our webinar today. This is the person you're hearing now speaking. This is Harrison. I'm primarily Blueprint Protect's third-party risk management lead. So I do a lot of work with a lot of different customers, conducting third-party risk assessments, but also facilitating the optimization process as well to help design third-party risk management programs for the organization, from all the way from documenting policies and procedures to incorporating automation, which is another thing we're going to highlight today. So what we did in preparation of this webinar to show you guys is I looked through a variety of risk assessments that we've conducted to try to identify some of the most popular gaps or leading areas of non-compliance across those various risk assessments, like hundreds of risk assessments. So I've tried to come up with some of those top 10 common risks that we've found. The first one I want to highlight is a lack of documented policies and procedures. So often organizations are really like missing documentation for a variety of different aspects of security. Most commonly, we see things like audit logging and event monitoring, of course, third-party risk management, sometimes even overall risk management. So some organizations really don't have much or the documentation that they do have in place is really kind of lacking in detail and don't really meet industry standards to provide that necessary level of guidance to the personnel within their organizations. Additionally, some things we usually see with said documentation is that it's rarely reviewed, and if it's updated on a very inconsistent basis. What we prefer to see is that documentation is spreads out across all aspects of the security program and is consistently reviewed minimally on an annual basis. The second risk I want to highlight is that some of the organizations don't or have compatibility with outdated security protections. Some of the security protections I highlighted or I see the most often involve things like HTTPS with TLS 1.1 and 1.0. So basically both of these are vulnerable and really should be disabled, and really only TLS 1.1 and 1.3 should be leveraged. even supporting this capability anymore is, probably kind of looked down upon. So those are things that should be fixed to eliminate those vulnerabilities. The third one I want to highlight is involves security risk assessments being performed on an ad hoc basis. So with this being performed on an infrequent basis, it leads to identify like there are more risks that you're missing out on. The best practice really is to perform an SRA on an annual basis. Now, SRAs can either be performed internally by qualified personnel or externally by a qualified third party. So most of the time we see organizations attempting to assess their own risk rather than utilizing an outside third party to evaluate their practices and their security controls to come up with additional risks. So sometimes risks can be overlooked if they continue to just assess internally. The third one I'm calling out is, of course, the lack of third-party risk management program. So most organizations that I've evaluated don't really have a strong TPRM program in place. A large majority of the time, they just make sure that contracts are signed, but they don't go through the whole automation process. More or less, the programs are scattered and undocumented. So another leading area of noncompliance is really a lack of visibility into user activity as well. So as we all know, best practice is really to utilize a SIEM tool or some sort of similar tool to log and actively monitor user activity, especially activity that interacts with PHI. So often monitoring is really like a kind of a passive and only performed as needed. And really without active monitoring, it's really challenging to set up, quality alerting, which helps to mitigate threats or identify incidents before they get out of control. So that's the first 5. The next 5 I want to highlight. Let me navigate to the next slide. So building off of those top 5, some other ones we've identified involve insufficient training. So basically, most organizations have some sort of privacy and security training in place, but these generic trainings don't really provide enough detail on handling specific security trends in place. And the one I want to point out most in particular are trainings having to do with phishing. For everyone, as everyone's aware, ransomware is really basically a huge industry in and of itself today. And the biggest or the weakest link in an organization's security program is always the employee. So we believe that more care should really be given to training employees on what to look out for in order to, avoid something like a catastrophic effect of ransomware to your organization. Another gap we've identified more and more often that you may not think of is a lack of industry-leading security controls involving things like multi-factor authentication. So some vendors that we've evaluated have actually indicated that their platform does not support the use of MFA, which is not a good thing, of course. So things we've been seeing are that organizations are now moving towards that being actually a deal breaker. So without MFA, some organizations we've worked with are now opting out of contracts or deciding not to pursue a relationship without the MFA functionality. Another gap we've identified is that application vulnerability scanning and penetration testing is really performed on an infrequent basis as well. So these kinds of application vulnerability scans and penetration tests should kind of go hand in hand with security risk assessments. They should be performed more or less on an annual basis, but what we're seeing is that they're kind of performed as needed, and sometimes penetration tests are even performed every 2 years or even more frequent than that, which just opens up, the application or your organization to a variety of risks that you didn't know were possible. So one aspect which we'll talk a little bit more about a little later on is resiliency. So as you guys are all aware, most organizations have some sort of business continuity plan or disaster recovery plan in place, but just having these 2 documents doesn't really go a step further and identify the critical systems that you need to ensure are able to recover in the event of a major impact to the business. Thus, we always recommend that a business impact analysis be performed. And what we're finding is that vendors aren't performing such analysis on an annual basis as they should to meet industry best practice. Then the final gap I want to point out involves specific controls around identity and access management. So a few risks we've been seeing on a reoccurring basis are things like the use of service accounts or generic accounts, allowing things like inactive accounts to remain on the identity access management platform. Usually we see infrequent user access reviews, and definitely sometimes not strictly following the principle of least privilege. So they just allow everyone to have administrative access rights to their devices or to sensitive information systems containing covered information. So now that's really the top 10 risks we've been seeing. So when we identify these risks, especially if they're medium or high risks, depending on the probability and impact of these different findings, what we do is we present these findings to the vendors themselves. And usually we see one of three different reactions. So usually the first response we'll see is either people will become defensive and provide a lot of pushback. Some organizations, vendors, don't really like to be told that they have gaps, especially if we're performing an assessment against them. Often they're like, well, you're just trying to like check the box. And they kind of get defensive over the fact that we're trying to point holes or show them the gaps that we've identified based on their responses to the questionnaire or to the self-assessment that we provided. A second response that we usually see is that most organizations will either engage with our security team to provide evidence of mitigating controls that they have put into place and address those gaps. So most of the time, vendors are actually aware of the gaps, which is good because that means they probably have a good risk management program in place. So they're actively identifying and implementing corrective action plans to address those gaps. So that's what we'd love to see. The last response, and easily the best response, which is why I gave it a smiley face, is that organizations actually do appreciate that we go forward and we help them identify their gaps. They appreciate our feedback, and then they also work with us and work with our customers to remediate the gaps in order to reduce or eliminate our risks. So with all that being said, I want to ask you, Vikas, since now we have like a better understanding of the leading gaps and the typical responses that we expect or that we see from vendors, what are some areas of compliance or remediation that most vendors struggle with?
Yeah, thank you, Harrison. And I'll kind of provide more of a global perspective, sort of an broad industry perspective on this. There are obviously, you can do a Google search out there and you'll find various top 5 lists, top 10 lists. We presented our top 10 of what we typically find. But I really kind of distill all the different types of risks that are typically found into really 3 areas. The first being just overall compliance, right? We know in healthcare that we have certain organizations that are solely healthcare focused, and they tend to be better at understanding what their compliance requirements are. But we also have, whether it's startups or whether it's companies that are coming from different industries into healthcare, oftentimes there is a lack of understanding of what the compliance requirements are. Most people have heard of HIPAA, but there may be other ones like PCI if you're doing credit card transactions and other things as well, SOC 2 potentially also. So really, it's a compliance. You can put a lot of the top things that you see out there under a compliance banner. So companies, vendors really should understand what their fundamental compliance requirements are, because that's kind of table stakes, right? In order to get into and work with an organization. The other area is really the inability, and you pointed to it, Harrison, the inability to properly monitor your security program, whether it be at the technical level, technical controls, network controls, identity and access, as you talked about, or again, your compliance posture and the inability to monitor and manage that. Training for workforce and staff. So a lot of the things that you've talked about, they fall into this general monitoring category. So, our recommendation is for organizations to really think about and put a good monitoring program into place to make sure that you're not doing a one and done kind of an approach with your security program. Security teams at our organizations, at our clients, are just too sophisticated now. They see through that. They will see that you're doing a one and done, fix it once and hopefully just move forward type of approach, or are you an organization that has a continuous program in place which requires some sort of monitoring, whether process-based or technology-based. And then the third area really is the issue of scale and scalability. And you see this more with the bigger vendors, the bigger companies, is the lack of automation that exists in terms of their own security programs. So very manual processes, maybe underdeveloped or policies and procedures that really don't get a lot of attention or continuous attention. And then the ability for those handoffs within the security program between software developers to the CTO's office and technology and network folks to other folks that may be involved in the delivery of their product or their service. So how do you get everybody working from the same set of policies and procedures and following and complying with all of that? And then how do you keep moving your program forward? So to me, this is all a scalability issue. And automation, I think, is key. We are big believers in that, and we're going to talk about that a little bit later. And both for our clients as well as for our third parties, you should start to work on starting to automate components of your security program. So Harrison, sort of given that broad industry perspective, if you will, and bucketing what I see out there into those categories, I think it'd be great for you to share as a practitioner what you're seeing in terms of the areas that vendors really struggle with.
Yeah, absolutely. Definitely from a practitioner perspective, I think of these four areas. I really believe that practitioners really tend to struggle the most with corporate responsibility and therefore security, especially when it comes to like budgetary constraints. Third-party risk management is really often not considered like the biggest priority for organizations when they're trying to increase their security posture. Most of the time, it's budgetary restrictions are all, it's a big hurdle to have to cover. So a lot of organizations dedicate a lot of money to providing necessary security controls to best protect the data and often overlook third-party risk management in general. So, it's kind of a common assumption that I'm seeing that as long as BAAs are in place or MSAs, SLAs, all those documents and all those contracts are signed, then the organization often considers the risk to be covered. But BAAs alone really don't ensure that the vendor in question adequately secures the data that's shared with them. And without a comprehensive TPRM program supported by leadership, in which the proper due diligence is performed in the such as like a third-party risk assessment through automation, then the probability, of like a third-party breach or some sort of an incident involving your sensitive information drastically increases. So, which leads me into wanting to provide emphasis on how crucial automation is and how beneficial it is for organizations to really streamline their entire third-party risk management program. So what I want to highlight real quick is the actual scattered process that exists right now. So there are really three main phases of TPRM, right? We've got intake. How does it all start, right? Normally, there is like procurement, legal, it depends on who's all involved within the organization. Usually some sort of internal stakeholder will gather the necessary details, such as put together like a contract. Sometimes the BAA is already put together. They gather the necessary information and then they submit the request to actually conduct a third-party risk assessment. So it varies from organization to organization. Sometimes this third-party risk assessment occurs before the contract is signed, but often we're seeing that these risk assessments are actually performed after the contract has already been signed. So it really kind of depends on the organization itself when this risk assessment is performed. Obviously, we would love to see it be performed prior to the contract being signed so that we can assess the risk and really provide the organization with a good understanding of what the vendor is, what their security controls are in place, and what the overall risk level is. So after the information is gathered, it's sent over to an internal assessor. It could be a team of assessors, or depending on the employees, it could just be one or two assessors. The assessor will then, communicate with the third party, usually via email. Everything is very scattered, conducted on various different vendor lists, spreadsheets. Tracking is, non-existent. Either way, they're working with the vendor to gather the necessary information. Everything is mostly questionnaire, Excel-based. We're all familiar with that. And then usually a report is compiled, sent over to a board for review, who then reviews the identified risks and can either approve, deny, or accept the risk. Everything just is scattered from beginning to end. So the best way to eliminate this or to really strengthen this is to fix it with automation. And that is where, one of the things that we specialize in. So our platform is called Blueprint Protect, and what our platform does is it streamlines the entire process from intake. So once the organization has determined that they are pursuing a relationship with a vendor and they're going through the contractual process, what they'll do is they'll reach out to the internal stakeholder to actually submit an assessment request. What automation does is it streamlines the entire process in a platform for a place to put the request in, to work with the third-party vendor contact based on the information provided, to facilitate the information centrally located within one platform rather than going back and forth via email. Then a group of assessors or our security team can then go in and conduct the assessment all through the platform, eliminating the back and forth via email. Everything is centrally located, which is something I'm trying to drive home here. And then after we've gone through, sent the detailed self-assessment over, we will analyze their responses, put together a report, and then present it to the organization for review to once again either approve, deny, or accept the risk. What automation also does as well is it provides good status tracking. It provides good dashboarding capabilities. It gives you a good view into what your third-party risk management is, what are some high areas of risk, and what are you doing to make the correct informed decisions about your organization, which tees it up perfectly for Vikas to drive us home.
Well, thank you, Harrison. I appreciate that. So really, is what we mentioned right at the very beginning, one of the key, probably the key outcome that we're looking for and trying to help our clients get to is truly informed decision making. So a lot of what Harrison has described to you in terms of the process, so you're probably resonating either with that manual sort of process in the first slide that he showed, or maybe you've automated, started to do automation or use an automation tool like Blueprint Protect to start to automate that process. You're probably in between one of those two camps there. But ultimately, all that process, what it's supposed to deliver is this informed decision making. And some of the best practices that we've seen out there from organizations that do a really good job of really informed decision making is about risk and risk management, right? Ultimately, bringing a vendor solution into your organization, you are introducing a certain level of risk. So it's really now up to the organization to really identify and manage that risk and see if it is acceptable to bring into the organization that level of risk associated with that particular solution or with that particular company. So one of the things we recommend is to define some governance structure here, an independent body. Hopefully a very representative body that represents the different facets of the organization, but it's an independent body that is empowered to review information and make decisions for the organization relative to risk management, which means that business as well as technology, as well as security and privacy, in some cases, stakeholders should be a part of that independent group that is responsible for the program. It is not just an issue for the security team, right? It is really an organizational risk management issue. Other things that lead to better and informed decision making is efficient ways of data collection. So that second bullet point about reviewing the engagement and then looking at the outcomes of the assessment, it's really about gathering and crystallizing data in a consumable way, especially if you have business stakeholders that are part of your review body and your review process. And that then hopefully leads to sort of this shared criticality analysis, the ability to critically review that information, understanding the business outcomes and objectives, and then weighing the risks against it. That hopefully leads to options that you can consider. We saw on the previous slide, do you approve that particular vendor solution? Do you deny it? Or the third, which is quite typical is that you probably will approve it, but with certain remediation requirements. And this is really where your team as well as your software can come into place, that then allows you to, again, continue to monitor. One of those big sort of gaps that I referred to earlier is to be able to monitor that, is this particular vendor complying with your remediation requirements? And then are you having them reassessed at some interval, whether it's, annually for tier 1, every couple of years for tier 2, and so forth. I'm sure you have tiers in your third-party risk management program, but aligning that together and making sure that's well organized as well. And then another really key part of it is the ability or really the necessity to assign ownership for that particular solution. Again, this is typically business business stakeholders that are asking for certain solutions. And best practice for us is that those business stakeholders really are the owners of the risk that's introduced, and they accept that risk or deny that risk or accept it with certain remediation requirements. But they should, it should be facilitated and therefore an informed decision. And then ultimately, hopefully it's a closed loop process, and you're therefore now have the ability to implement that particular decision with that particular vendor. So if you have that proper governance structure, you have the proper policies and procedures to guide it, the proper team and the group, we believe that does lead to informed decision making, which is ultimately the outcome that we're looking for all organizations. So with that, Harrison, I'll ask, we'll move to the next slide and really get into some of our Q&A, but any closing or final thoughts from you on this topic?
Yeah, the only thing I really want to drive home is really the importance of automation. A lot of the organizations we've been seeing and that we're working with right now are really have their TPRM program scattered, right? It's more of a manual process, more or less undocumented, and it's a tough challenge and a tough hurdle to have to evaluate however many different vendors. And what we provide is a great automation tool to help streamline that process. So I can only talk ever so highly of how important automation is. But, yeah.
Well, thank you, Harrison. Really appreciate that, and thank you for your comments and sharing your insights from all the work that you've done. And we do have some questions, so now you're going to be on the hot seat. First question, really good question. I'm going to paraphrase it because it was kind of long, but the question is really around vendors that have adopted either high trust or SOC 2. Do you tend to find that organizations that have adopted high trust have a better security program than those that have adopted a SOC 2 certification?
Yeah, absolutely. So just as a little bit of an overview, so as part of our automation or our platform, we do request that vendors do provide some sort of a certification report or whatnot. Often or not, the vendor will provide some sort of a report, usually SOC 2 or high trust. They are great certifications to provide, and it really does show that the organization has tried to go that extra mile to prove that their security program is in place. But when we're looking at the two of them, I really strongly believe that having the high trust certification really provides more of a heavy-hitting proof that your security program has gone through the necessary steps to make sure that strong security controls are in place. For example, I know for a fact that high trust, in order to become high trust certified, you have to go through a long, complex process in which your security controls are evaluated like 4 different times by different assessors. Whereas in order to become SOC 2 certified, you really only have to go through one validation process. So high trust is definitely more complex, more overarching compared to SOC 2. So if a vendor is high trust certified, that's definitely a huge plus.
So both really good to have, or one or the other, but you're just saying high trust, you find the rigor of going through a high trust certification leads to a more optimized security program?
Absolutely.
Great, thank you for sharing that. Okay, so let me go to another one here. So you Of the top 10, again, I'm going to paraphrase these questions. So of the top 10 that you identified, issues that you most commonly see, which ones really stick out to you? What are the top 2 or 3, let's say?
So the top 2, the one I see the most reoccurring really is undocumented policies and procedures. You know, what we ask to see is a lot of evidence that you have that organizations have a strong security program in place, and most of the time organizations just provide a very short policy, or they say that policies are in development, or rather they just haven't documented the necessary topics to show that they have a strong and comprehensive security program in place, which is quite shocking because that's often some of the easiest things to tackle, is to document your policies and procedures and spread them and distribute them throughout the organization. Some other things which are most shocking, it really are just inadequate security controls. I mean, it varies from assessment to assessment, but when we see things like missing MFA or missing patching, or not having adequate like encryption protocols in place, or not having encryption for data at rest, or trying to delegate the responsibility elsewhere, it's kind of shocking because there are so many vulnerabilities in place, and most organizations should be aware of those vulnerabilities and try to mitigate them as soon as possible to avoid things like breaches or incidents and attacks from malicious actors.
Great. Thank you.
Those are really the top 2. Yeah.
Thank you for that. So, this question from me as a follow-up to that. So policies and procedures, as you said, fundamental, right? For especially to us security professionals, just fundamental. So when you encounter somebody that doesn't have sort of a good quality set of policies and procedures, or they say that they're still in development, what is typically our remediation recommendation to our clients relative to that vendor? What do we typically recommend?
So undocumented policies and procedures really don't carry as much of a heavy risk, in our opinion, compared to those security controls, which actually impact the covered information stored. So when we go back to the customer, we'll say, like, look, this vendor does not have a strong documented information security program, something to look out for. Definitely advise the organization to continue to develop the necessary information policies, procedures, standards, and then when they go through and do a reassessment a year later to fulfill that requirement of doing an annual assessment against your vendors, we strongly encourage them to follow up and to make sure that those policies and procedures have been documented, and maintain a risk register. We want to make sure that the risk is being tracked, so maybe the customer can periodically follow up with the vendor contact to make sure that the risks that we've identified are being closed out, and at least they're providing the mitigating controls, or they're actively trying to remediate some of the risks we identified, such as lack of documentation.
Great, thanks for that. Here's another one. So do you recommend security code reviews of our software?
I think I'll need a little bit more context. Is there any more context for the question?
No, but I think what they're talking about more than likely is the actual software code itself, the software development team behind the software, there obviously you can do a security review of the system and the application, but I guess this would be a question related to the actual code itself.
Yeah, I think it really kind of depends on what the application interacts with. What we can certainly do, and there's different sections, different questionnaires. There's a specific section dedicated to software development, right? So things you can certainly ask for is evidence that like static and dynamic code testing is in place. Actually, a lot of organizations might provide pushback when you ask to see their source code. That's usually considered super proprietary, and I'll be surprised if vendors try to will release that information over for analysis. Most of the time, they'll try to provide evidence that they go through the proper testing, such as that static and dynamic code testing. You can certainly ask for evidence of said testing, but I would be pretty surprised if they allowed you to review their source code.
And for anybody who is interested in doing something like that, this has nothing to do with our company or any of our clients, but there's a product called Black Duck out there. Similar products are out there. If you really want to do a source code review, you can use products like that as well. So we'll go from a very specific question to a very broad one. So we are a startup. How do you recommend we build out our security program? So my guess here is that they are just starting to, get their product developed, built, or service going. So what are recommendations that, based on your experience, you would have for startups that really don't have a security program? What are some of the best practices they should follow?
So first off, designing it from the ground up, you got to start with developing a good set of information security policies and procedures. We've said it countless times during this webinar, but it is extremely important to document exactly how you go about implementing the necessary security controls to protect whatever is involved in your business. And then you kind of build up from there. You got to make sure that you have the right documentation laid out, you have the right processes, and then you build off of those processes to make things a reality, right? So you start implementing different security controls. You can purchase TPRM related automation for Blueprint Protect to handle TPRM. It's just you start implementing different controls such as identity access management to manage your access and whatnot. You want to definitely include some sort of event logging, alerting software. But it really kind of depends on what service your startup is offering, because it could be like a cloud-based platform where a lot of the security protections are already provided by the cloud provider, whereas it could be something else that you are building internally and then you work with like data centers. It really depends, but I think the core focus should be on laying the groundwork for your security program and then build from there.
And I'll just say personally, as somebody who's sort of a big proponent of frameworks, that even if you're a startup, and Harrison, tell me if you agree, I think adopting a framework early on in the development process of your product, I think is really, really important. Sort of to your point, building security into the foundational layer of your particular solution. So whether it's NIST, whether it's high trust, whether it's ISO, if you're dealing with EU, but adopting a framework I know is daunting, certainly, but if given the ability, I would certainly recommend that. What do you think?
I could not agree more. I think that's a great point. Definitely focusing in on things like NIST and ISO, high trust is definitely daunting, but having that framework really helps lay the groundwork for you to develop and implement your security program. Couldn't agree more.
Yeah. I almost think of it as a roadmap. It's especially if you don't know how to get going, it kind of is a roadmap. It requires, sort of dedication, time, and effort, but certainly I think the payoff is certainly there. And even from a business, I'll just say valuation standpoint, the better your security program, the better value your business is going to have overall. Okay, last question. And I think this is kind of a yes/no, but you can certainly expound if you want. Do our security risk analysis need to be HIPAA based? So I assume this means somebody that's not doing HIPAA based SRAs, do they need to be HIPAA based? And I assume again the context here is for healthcare.
There's kind of a middle ground. No, they don't need to be HIPAA based, but if your organization or if the scope of the assessment has to do with PHI and sensitive covered information, then certainly HIPAA-based SRAs are definitely the way to go. But it really kind of just depends on the scope of the organization.
You're right. That there is that middle ground there. I thought, I'm so focused on healthcare, healthcare organizations. You're right. It all depends whether there's PHI involved or EPHI involved or not, right? So, well, terrific. Well, thank you so much. I did want to mention, we got you specifically got a little bit of a thank you, a little shout out here. I won't say the last name, but Lydia, thank you for your comment there. She said that just want to say that thank you for sharing the top 10 risks. We have been adopting high trust, and it's great to hear that we've covered off on all those top risks by virtue of implementing the program. So I think, sort of validation from one of our attendees to, what we've been talking about relative to frameworks and the posture of organizations of adopting frameworks. So thank you, Lydia, for that commentary. And with that, Harrison, thank you for sharing some really, really great thoughts and insights based on all the work that you've done. If you would like to receive a copy of this presentation, you can email Suzanne Edson and she will send that out to you. We will also be, just as a heads up, posting, we have information about our Blueprint Protect platform on our website, but we'll also have a short 2-minute video that we'll be releasing. They'll give you a little bit of a live look into some of the software that'll be coming out in a few weeks. And as always, this is part of an educational series of webinars that our company puts on for the industry, and we'll provide more information about future webinars coming up through LinkedIn and our email distribution and things of that nature. So just want to thank all of our attendees for joining us today. We really appreciated your time. And you've got a little bit of time before your next meeting, hopefully, and we look forward to talking to you again in the very near future. So thank you, Harrison, again.
And thank you, Vikas. Thanks, everyone.
Okay, have a good day, everyone.